At the end of episode 3, I had a big question. How might Aemond respond to Aegon crashing his mommy time with Sylvie? Obviously, this is part of a long history of bullying from his older brother, something he shared with the madam the last time we saw them together. And regardless of anything else, it makes for a powerful scene seeing him put on this facade to act like it doesn't bother him. That mirrors the scene of Aegon putting on the amazing Valyrian steel armor that belonged to the Conqueror. On top of the second sun energy I mentioned in my last video, this scene shows Aemond's got some stuff going on, which becomes even more tragic because of this encounter. Now that he's been exposed in this way, pun intended, you could also insert a joke about his nickname One Eye here. It's not likely he'll be using Sylvie as a confidant to talk through his issues anytime soon. That he has these issues isn't very surprising. I mentioned the bullying, and losing an eye in the process of claiming Vhagar is pretty messed up, even if his being a complete shit justified Luke's attempt to save his brother. The way it seems to not be entirely sexual, the fetal position, and maybe some more stuff that might have been happening in episode 3, made me go looking to see if the showrunner or the actors weighed in on what they were going for in depicting this relationship. Ewan Mitchell, who plays Aemond, told Variety, "Someone asked me the other day whether or not I thought Aemond had mommy issues. And I don't know if he had mommy issues, or rather he wanted to be loved by his mom a little bit more. Growing up, he never really felt that unconditional love. He had to find surrogates elsewhere. He sort of found it in his dragon Vhagar, this older she-dragon, and he's also found it with the madam. But whether or not it's enough, if it's a worthy enough surrogate, is questionable." Even more interesting than that, elsewhere in the article, they asked Geeta Patel, who directed the episode, about the decision to use full frontal nudity in the brothel scene. She talked about how it was important for her to have the actor decide if he was comfortable enough to do this, and the process of discovering if it made sense for the character. They realized that he created the persona of someone who is callous and doesn't care what others think of him in response to being hurt by the bullying in his childhood. She said the scene was one of the few times you see the young child in him. So he begins to put on this armor he created when he stands up, and in the director's words, the fact that he doesn't care you see his penis is such a strong visceral shift. So why even bring any of this up? Haven't we moved on? Aren't we here to talk about what happened in episode 4? We are, and we will. But this all gets at what I think was missing from the first season, and why this episode has me more pumped up for House of the Dragon than I've ever been before. It's certainly not just about an amazing action-packed set piece, which this was, or limited to how well some of the decisions Aemond makes at the end of this episode land. But those are, in a way, the perfect examples because man do they land. It's worth thinking about why that is. About 16 minutes into episode 4, I thought we were watching Aemond get back at Aegon. The king wanted to know why he wasn't consulted about Criston's new plan, and Aemond switched to High Valyrian to hilariously say he thought his brother was too busy with other things like coming up with a cool nickname. It was such a perfect burn that it could have ended there, but these aren't regular people from a normal family. They're Targaryen dragon lords. This is why Rhaenyra thought it was necessary to exhaust every possibility of finding a peaceful solution before choosing the nuclear option. Even something as far-fetched as sneaking into enemy territory without a plan. The nuclear option in this case isn't just about pressing a button and inflicting mass casualties while waiting for a response. You have to strap a family member to the weapons of mass destruction in this story. I'll get back to that and how the Battle of Rook's Rest came together, but there's also a lot of interesting stuff happening in the Riverlands that we should get out of the way first. Damons Visions featuring a much younger Rhaenyra continue as episode 4 opens with him walking into the throne room in King's Landing. This is where we first saw them interact with each other in a great scene in the series premiere. This time things are flipped with Damon walking in to find Rhaenyra sitting on the throne instead of the other way around. She's wearing the Conciliator's crown, and at first he can't make out what she's saying. There was quite a bit of discussion about bringing Millie Alcock back, and the reason why Damon sees her when she was younger rather than as the woman he's married to now. I interpreted this as them wanting a shortcut to represent that his past is haunting him. If we saw Emma Darcy, that might indicate he's thinking about their current split, but by bringing Millie back, which I mean you'd want to do that anyway since her performance helped define the character, but that image of her screams he's thinking about his past. Having episode 4 start in the same place they shared their first scene continues to do that, but also makes you start thinking about what aspects of their relationship he might regret. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, showrunner Ryan Condal expanded on this, saying that of course they wanted to bring Meleys back because they loved the actor. But the original idea for the cameo came from a desire to tell a haunted house story for Damon and confronting what terrifies him the most. Instead of warfare or dragons or images of horror, it was really more of him being haunted by these people who he had done wrong by in his past, particularly young Rhaenyra. That's the girl who took his claim, not elder Rhaenyra, played by Emma Darcy. It's that version of Rhaenyra that removed him as the heir to the throne, and then was named heir and took his claim. Condal continued, as you'll see his story at Heron Hall unfold, there's an element of Damon having to reckon with his past and choices he's made and things that he's done. This week's opening vision makes that pretty explicit. In High Valyrian, the young Rhaenyra says, "You created me, Damon, yet you are now set on destroying me. All because your brother loved me more than he did you." He then pulls out his sword and cuts off her head while the crown falls to the floor. Then her disembodied head says, "This is what you always wanted, is it not?" What's most fascinating about this is how injecting the idea that this was all because his brother loved her more marks this as being entirely from Damon's perspective. Later in the episode, we'll be reminded that the real Rhaenyra has a completely different idea about why Viserys chose her over Damon. It's the same thing she told him in the season 1 finale that led to him choking her. When she tells her named heir Jace about Aegon's prophecy, passing it down as her father did with her, before she sends the dragons to war, from Rhaenyra's perspective, there isn't much question about why she was named heir. The fight from the finale was briefly set aside because of Luke's death, then eventually continued after the Queen realized that Damon made her complicit in the death of Jaehaerys. In that, he argues that his brother chose her because he was afraid that Damon would outshine him with his greatness, more or less, which sounds a lot more like cope than what was actually happening. His argument makes it stand out just how much it hurt him that he was never his brother's choice, which makes Rhaenyra saying he's pathetic in her last words to him sting even more. So Damon's got a lot kicking around in his head, and Heron Hall seems to have a way of bringing it out. Perhaps since the young prince makes an appearance, there's some genuine regret about killing a child. I still think that's kind of up for debate, but maybe the implication is that he's more than just an agent of chaos that's a lot of fun to watch. Later in the episode, he also sees his second deceased wife, Laena, briefly, which is another situation where you're left wondering how much he really felt about that. What did he tell Rhaenyra when she asked if he loved Laena? We were happy enough? The time we spend with him in Heron Hall isn't only about his dreams. Sir Simon comes to wake him up with news of a raven, filling him in on Cole's successful advance in the Crown Lands. His army has tripled its strength, with houses Rosby and Stokeworth bending the knee to Aegon. The negative PR has been paying off, as both houses cited Jaehaerys' death when declaring for the king. This is what Cole and Aemond were planning when Otto walked in on them in this season's premiere, and they later laid out to the small council after he became Hand. It appears to be working, and Sir Simon warns Damon that even if he can raise a host of rivermen to fight for him, they won't be ready in time if Cole heads directly to Heron Hall. Still, that's what he came there to do, so he meets with a very young Oscar Tully, grandson to the infirmed Grover we've heard so much about in passing, and the future Lord Paramount of the Riverlands. In the show, his father Elmo died when he was young, and it appears they merged Oscar with his brother Kermit, making him the only person that could represent House Tully in this exchange. Damon opens things up by suggesting he smother his grandfather with a pillow so that he can take over, and when he finds out he can't speak for the man who clearly can't speak for himself, he understands why the Brackens and Blackwoods weren't afraid to war with each other, since their liege lord's House Tully is a fish with no head. That's a reference to their house sigil, which you might remember from Game of Thrones. Tully is the house of Catelyn Stark, her brother Edmure, her sister Lysa Arryn, and her uncle Brynden Blackfish. And yes, George R.R. Martin named their ancestors from the time of the Dance of the Dragons after some of the Muppets from Sesame Street. That shouldn't distract from the fact that this is one of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms. But with Grover currently incapacitated, and Oscar unwilling to speak for his grandfather while he's still alive to pledge their forces to his cause, Damon decides to set a meeting with House Blackwood instead. Before that comes together, he experiences another vision. It works out well that his door has this big gap between it and the floor, and through that he sees a man with a torch walk by. He gets up and follows, and at first, when you can only see the back of the head, I thought it was going to be a young King Viserys. But when Damon starts to close in, from the gate you get the sense that it's Aemond. It's so recognizable that I wouldn't be surprised if they came out to say that Ewan Mitchell did the walking here. But when the person turns, you see that it's Damon himself wearing an eye patch to make him look like his nephew. Before he can confront the figure, he finds himself in a room where Alys Rivers is alone working on a potion late at night like you do. This was good news because she provided some of the backstory I held back on in my episode 3 video. I know that most people look this stuff up or go looking for a video that does that for you, but parsing the details the show chooses to provide is more interesting because of the added bonus of letting us know what aspects of the lore are important to the story of this telling of the dance. We learn that she's a bastard and acts as a sort of maester, inheriting those duties after the last one fled in the night. When Damon asks why, she says he just never settled in, with a quick pivot to ask how he's doing on that front. He's somewhat confrontational and never answers any of her questions, while she just sort of continues asking pointed questions in a pleasant and casual tone, all while combining some fairly exotic looking ingredients. She tells him that Heron Hall has been cursed since its first stone was laid, as a matter of fact, with her conviction serving as a reminder that she told him he'd die at Heron Hall in much the same way. She adds that Black Heron felled a grove of weirwood trees, heart trees imbued with the spirits of those who lived long before he came there, to make room for his massive castle. When Damon scoffs at the idea that some say you still hear their whispers sometimes, calling it a midwife's tale, she tells him that the bed he's sleeping in was made from one of those heart trees, and with a smile questions if he's experienced anything of note. Then she asks if he came there after fighting with his wife. And since he's primed for it now, his reaction hints that he wonders how she might know that. But then she goes on to explain how she came to that conclusion just by observing what he's been doing. It makes for a really fun back and forth to watch. And as she questions how he feels about serving Rhaenyra, kind of acting like she's on his side, we see she knows a lot about what's going on with him, and there's no question that she's inside his head. Mentioning Heron the Black is a significant lore reference. She's talking about Heron Hall, whose grandfather Harwin Hardhand was a king of the Iron Islands who conquered the Riverlands in the century before the Targaryen conquest. There's a lot of interesting stuff from this period of history, but Heron the Black is the one character who seems essential to take a closer look at. He's described as a vain, bloody tyrant hated by those he ruled. His is a story of hubris, and Heron Hall is his 40-year project that drained the coffers of the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, while claiming the lives of thousands of slaves who were forced to work on its construction. Heron built the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms as a monument to himself. When it was complete, he rightly claimed that it was completely secure against the contemporary conventional armies on the continent. Unfortunately for him, on the same day he moved into his new fortress, Aegon the Conqueror invaded Westeros with his dragons. Heron opted to hide inside his well-stocked monstrosity of a castle rather than taking a fairly reasonable deal that would allow him to keep Heron Hall if he agreed to become Aegon's vassal. When he refused, Balerion the Black Dread was unleashed, and Heron and his sons were burned alive in the tallest tower of the castle. The damage from the dragon fire is why the castle still looks destroyed all these years later. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but it's worth noting House Horror's fall at the height of its power in a show about a family that's also in that place. A show that was prefaced with the idea that the only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon was itself. Perhaps what's most pertinent to Damon's time at Heron Hall is the mention of cutting down the weirwood trees, since Alys implies that his visions are tied to that. I wonder if he'll continue to try to sleep in that bed after this conversation. You gotta love how the guy who complained that his brother was a slave to his omen's importance is in this place with this person. One other detail that may come up is that Black Heron built his castle on the shore of the God's Eye, which is the largest lake in the Seven Kingdoms, and hands down its most fascinating location, in my opinion. The Isle of Faces lies in the middle of it, and that's where the first men and the children of the forest signed their pact in the Age of Heroes. Alys is enigmatic by design, as I brought up in my episode 3 video. This is the first character who is connected to, if not practicing, some type of magic that's related to, if not coming from, the old gods. Gayle Rankin, the actor who plays her, told Entertainment Weekly, "I really love the challenge of a woman being recounted as some people say this and some people say this. I'm always fascinated by and drawn to female characters who are tossed around by society and culture. I really tried personally to make her my own and ground her in reality, because you can stereotype someone who's a healer or a sorcerer or a witch or any of the above." She went a little deeper than that, but I think it's important to remember that this is her perspective from playing the character, not necessarily the intention of the writers. She says this person can tell the future, basically. She's someone who has all of this power, who's been alive for potentially 400 years. She teases she's going to hold a lot of power for the men inside of this story, especially Damon, which I think is a really interesting slow burn. What's interesting is, what does Alys want from Damon and vice versa? She goes on to add, what are they learning from each other? There's clearly a match happening here. So take that with a grain of salt, or a grain of whatever that was that she was tossing into her concoction. It's funny how quickly Damon takes her potion and drinks it after being so cautious about the venison from Sir Simon. A reserved, well-spoken knight who bends the knee versus a spooky potion lady who you always see right after you have a crazy vision. And yeah, well, I guess when you put it that way, it all makes sense. After he takes a sip, he loses some time, and it cuts directly to him taking a drink out of a different cup while he's attending a meeting with House Blackwood and looking a little out of it. And if you thought things at Heron Hall couldn't get any better, he's sitting there talking to Willam Blackwood, who we see is now all grown up. He even mentions that he was once a suitor of Rhaenyra's, which I'm sure you'll remember because that season 1 encounter ended with him gutting Gerald Bracken. Damon does get it together enough to ask if the Blackwoods want to fight because they're loyal to Rhaenyra, or if it's just another excuse to bloody their swords. But then the cupbearer appears to him as Laena, and that takes him out again. We hear Willam say once they bring the Queen's Justice to the Brackens, they'll have House Blackwood's swords, but then it cuts away, leaving things there for the Heron Hall part of the story for this episode. Everything else in this episode is focused on setting up the ending. In King's Landing, we see Alicent holding the dragon from Viserys' model of Old Valyria that set up the moment when she won his heart by having it fixed for him. That falls to the floor and breaks again just before the Grand Maester arrives to deliver her moon tea, with the implication being that her time with Criston resulted in a pregnancy that she has to end. While she has Orwell there, she asks if he believes Viserys wanted Aegon to succeed him, and while his face definitely says no, he just says it never came up. We see that Cole's campaign in the Crown Lands has made it to Duskendale. The Darklands put up a fight, and Criston offers to let those who bend the knee to Aegon and fight for him be allowed to live before putting Lord Darkland to the sword. This is the father of the leader of Rhaenyra's Queen's Guard, Steffon Darkland, who we saw accompany her to King's Landing to meet with Alicent in the previous episode, and we see him get the news when he returns to Dragonstone. There's not much more to add here. They're hitting the closest castles to King's Landing, and this is the first one where the Lord wouldn't break his oath to Rhaenyra. Cole's army is growing, and he gets a message that we'll eventually understand is from Aemond as he changes their plan, telling Sir Gawain they'll be sticking to the coast, which means they're not heading to the Riverlands after all. At the Green Small Council meeting, Aegon is pissed when he hears that Damon has taken Heron Hall. He screams at his new Master of Whispers, since it is his castle. Larys tries to reassure him that it's more crippled than he is and will do nothing to sap Damon's resolve and maybe drive him to madness, while Rhaenyra is stuck on her island and Sir Criston continues felling castles in the Crownlands. This gets through to him, but he still doesn't like to be out of the loop, so he really loses it when Aemond tells him that Heron Hall will have to wait because Cole's on his way to take Rook's Rest, which is really small and insignificant compared to Heron Hall, which is really big. I feel like there's a visual thing going on there. But it does belong to House Stanton, and their lord, Sir Simon, sits on Rhaenyra's Black Council. Because of where it's located on the coast, once they take it, they'll have Dragonstone effectively cut off by land. This is a much better plan, which Aegon eventually realizes, but it's also a big FU to the king to go behind his back and plan something like this out. Aemond knows this and takes things to the next level when he starts talking to his brother in High Valyrian. But it's also measured as if to say, I know my brother won't do anything about this but complain. In a later scene, when the council keeps talking about Cole and Aemond, Aegon complains that the council bores him and walks out. Because she wasn't at the council meeting, Rhaenys goes looking for Alicent, who's experiencing some of the negative side effects from the moon tea. She tries to pass it off as the result of overindulging in the lamprey pie, but he sees the tea's container, and she sees that he sees it. And when Criston comes up, he says she must worry about him being out there exposed to dragons. She reminds him that Cole is the hand of the king, so they should all be praying for his safe return. This is a pretty good setup, because if the hand were anyone else, she'd almost be hoping something would happen to them so that Aegon might bring Otto back. Her son put her in a tough spot when he replaced her father with her side piece. Rhaenys also notices history books open all over the place inside her chambers. We know that she's been shook since Rhaenyra brought up the prophecy, and is likely looking for anything that might help her feel like her mistake didn't lead to the war that is now quickly escalating. We also know she won't find it, and that probably means she knows that too, and in reality what she says to Rhaenys here is the truth of things now. The significance of Viserys' intentions died with him. Rhaenyra's supporters will believe what they want to, as will Aegon's, and many people will die as a result until someone wins and takes the throne. This is why she told Rhaenyra it was too late to try to find a peaceful resolution. Her search for books leads her to Aegon's room, where he starts complaining that his small council doesn't pay attention to him. She kind of tears into him, ultimately saying he should sit back and listen to the more experienced people around him. Spoiler alert, he does not. But her words are obviously the result of the buildup of all these different setbacks and tragedies coming one after the other, as is the decision he makes after she leaves. On the black side of things, Rhaenys goes to the docks to tell Corlys that Baela called her to Dragonstone, and while she's there, she ends up seeing Alan of Hall. After getting a good look at his face, she knows her husband is his father. This is something the show hinted at and something she brings up right away, and Corlys looks caught before getting defensive without ever denying it. She tells him that Alan's past isn't his fault. He saved his lord's life and should be raised up and honored rather than hidden beneath the tides. It allows Eve Best to do some great work, but makes the final one-on-one scene they share a sour one. This is kind of a shame considering that despite their issues, they're one of the most loving couples we spend time with. We got one of their warmer encounters in episode 3, and I couldn't comment on it at the time because of spoilers, but I liked how they set the emotional stakes without tipping their hand that Rhaenys was the one whose life would soon be in danger. She arrives at Dragonstone and finds a restless council losing patience with Jason Bella in Rhaenyra's absence. You can't really blame them either. Damon's gone with no word on his progress in the Riverlands. They know Cole is moving but don't have any actionable intelligence or a host to meet him. And one area where Rhaenyra has been pretty clear is not wanting to send her dragons into battle. No one knows where she is, so Rhaenys tries to step up, which they resent, since the queen hasn't made her hand. I haven't had a reason to get into the individual members of the Black Council since the Season 1 finale, but the loudest voice in the room here, Alfred Broom, is worth mentioning. Because he's a part of the council, and sitting around the table with these other lords, you might think he's from some important house. But he's actually just a house knight sworn to House Targaryen that's been at Dragonstone since Jaehaerys' reign. He is a member of the council, but there isn't even much information about his family from the Westerlands in the book. Corlys makes a grand entrance, throwing his weight around to shut Alfred down, but nothing can be done until Rhaenyra returns, which she finally does a little later, and her council was just about as shocked as I was that she went to King's Landing. Only she doesn't leave them to wonder about her intentions. She makes it plain that she inherited 80 years of peace from her father, and before she was to end it, she needed to know that there wasn't any other path. and now she does. She knows that she can either win her claim or she can die. And when they lay things out for her, with no army of her own, there really isn't any other option than to send a dragon. Her initial reaction is to go herself, which no one will get behind, and Jace, who's progressively been getting more pissed at his mother, almost loses it at the suggestion. Part of this is about him being a young man who wants to prove himself, but the other part is that he's right. This goes back to the problem with the nuclear option in this specific situation. She doesn't want to send her heir, her council can't fathom sending their leader, and as a mother argues with her son about which one is going to rain down Dragonfire, making the fair point that he lacks the necessary experience, Rhaenys steps up and volunteers to go. She has the biggest dragon who's already battle-tested, so there's no question she's the right choice. The stakes are incredibly high though. If she were to fall in battle, which she does, they would lose their largest dragon, which they do. And if she were to die, which she also does, Rhaenyra would lose a vital member of her council. It's not an easy decision, but it's one no one could fault the queen for making. Sir Criston drops a shocker of his own when he prepares his men to march on Rook's Rest in the middle of the day. Sir Gawain's protests that Dragonstone and the Black's dragons are right across the bay fall on deaf ears. From the viewer's perspective, it's pretty obvious that it's a trap that we know Aegon still isn't in on when we see him get restless, which makes it fairly certain that his continuing to drink wine as he puts on his armor will lead to disaster. While he's doing that, Rhaenyra tells Jace about the Song of Ice and Fire. She explains how the Targaryen who sits the Iron Throne is not just a king or queen. They're a protector ordained to lead the Seven Kingdoms, to strengthen them, and unite them against a common foe. This isn't new information to us, and thankfully most of their conversation takes place off screen. But she does add that she hadn't told him yet because she was unsure she believed it herself. To unite the realm, she has to send the dragons to war, and she stresses that the horrors she's just loosed can't be for a crown alone, which is why she has to believe what Viserys told her, what Jaehaerys told him, and she'll tell Jace now that they've moved past the point of no return. Depending on how you look at it, some of the decisions she's made in the last week or so would be hard to justify if this wasn't her motivation. Now that we're here, I think the show did its job to make this work and feel right in this moment. Their conversation is intercut with shots of Cole's forces advancing, Rhaenys approaching Meleys where we see their bond as she tells her old friend they're off to battle again, and the petulant king approaching his gorgeous golden dragon Sunfire. It's striking how the bond is clear and how it goes both ways regardless of how we feel about the rider. Also, the terror they instill as they fly overhead no matter who's in the saddle. The first leg of Aegon's journey marks the calm before the storm that Rhaenys and the Red Queen bring when they cross the bay from Dragonstone. Cole assures a frantic Gawain that things are going according to plan and orders his men to make the signal. As Meleys just incinerates scores of men on the battlefield, the signal makes its way to Aemond, who's managed to hide the largest dragon in the world in a clearing in the forest nearby. The trap is set, and it would have worked perfectly if Aegon had followed his mother's advice and just done nothing. In a way, this feels a little convenient, but in another, it never made great sense that the Greens would allow Aegon to risk himself in battle in the book when you really thought about it, especially when you know what happens at the end. For the most part, Vhagar would be enough to pull this plan off, which is why they planned it without Aegon, and this incredibly bad choice works because it's one this character would make. All of that happens before it gets good, because when Aemond sees his brother foolishly charging into a fight he has very little chance of winning, he does the opposite of rushing in to help him. He tells his dragon to wait. Everything that happens after that point kind of speaks for itself. The visceral quality of the battle puts you on an emotional roller coaster that I don't think a blow-by-blow account would enhance. The idea that Aemond operates on the spectrum of not being concerned if his brother dies to actively trying to incinerate him is a great addition. It's not necessarily a change since we had no idea what was going on in his head in the book. The change that affects this is that Aegon and Helaena haven't had Maelor yet. In Fire and Blood, when Jaehaerys died, their youngest son became the new heir. In the show's version of events, One Eye is currently next in line to sit on the throne. Is that why when he enters the battle at the point where Aegon is already losing, he has Vhagar burn Sunfire? I'm sure that plays a part, but to come back to what I was talking about in the beginning, at this point they've made Aemond into a fairly complicated character whose motivations can't be described in black and white terms. We know he believes he's the better choice to rule since he told Criston as much last season, and in that same episode we saw Aegon beg him to just let him slip away because he didn't want to be king. The only unimpeachable party at this family reunion is the queen who never was, and she's had some missteps on her way to get there. I'll never forget those small folk she crushed in the dragon pit without a second thought, and she's probably second guessing her decision to not kill these two and their entire family when she had the chance. While that wasn't my favorite turn the show took, it does add something to the drama, and that's where the show really feels like it arrived and became something better than it was in its first season. It feels like it's becoming a TV show, where we get to spend enough time with the characters to invest in who they are and feel like we understand where the choices they make are coming from. And make no mistake, visually it's a feat. They're not really fooling around when it comes to these dragons. They've gotten really good at the animations where we see them from behind as they fly into the frame. And through the way they engage with each other in battle, you can see why the singers dubbed this war the Dance of the Dragons. When you watch it over and over again, there are a few areas that could be improved. But overall, I was completely immersed the first time I watched, and floored every time just the same. They also managed to give the dragons some personality, which is no small task. And there's this surprising, almost pet-like feeling they achieve where you can dispassionately watch the humans getting wiped out all day long. But every small injury to the dragons gets you twisted up inside. It's kind of like how you can watch blood choke the hell out of cheese and be like, he knew what he was getting himself into, but want to jump out of your seat and choke him yourself whenever he kicks the dog. To get back to the plot, Aegon really undermined his cause when he decided that today was the right day to try to prove that he was just as fearsome as the rest of them. Everything is there to make this make sense, and this explosive impulsivity has been baked into his character from the beginning. There's also the idea that the show's gone back to multiple times. The peace has lasted so long that young men have forgotten the horrors of war, and those are a big part of this story no matter how it's told. It's been even longer since dragon riders have gone to war with each other. And can you imagine the feeling of power these kids get whenever they get on their dragons for the first time? King Viserys was right. It's a kind of power men should never have trifled with. And this is some Targ shit Aegon would normally be able to get away with if this wasn't a civil war. Or even if he would have been able to count on his brother having his back. I wonder if he was thinking of the pink dread after he realized One Eye had his nuke pointed directly at him just before he went down. That's where he ends up, and this is one of those endings that's a little vague because that's a better beat to go out on than any of the other choices, but I'm not sure if there's supposed to be a question if he's still alive when Criston walks up. I certainly know the answer, as do most people, I would say, and we'll find out how the show wants to explain that soon enough. And speaking of the most disliked character in the current moment of Westerosi history, he did his part on the battlefield to add to the overall impact of the way things played out. You can almost feel for him when he realizes that it's Aegon that's flying overhead. Plus the soldiers, the meat for the magic-blooded people's grinders. Man, I never want to find myself in a situation where I have to march towards something the size of Meleys that can fly and spit fire. What have I got here, a spear? And you want me to do what? That scene where Vhagar gets up to take off again after the fall really puts her dominance into perspective. What do you do when the other side has something like that? It's a real problem for the Blacks, and Aemond has to feel invincible coming out of this. In the end, Rhaenys' sacrifice is the emotional core, and it's one that doesn't secure any immediate victory for her side. It's quite the opposite. When we see Meleys' eye close in that amazing scene as she slips away, Rhaenyra is losing one of her most powerful weapons. From what we know about dragon lore, she experienced that moment together with her rider, and we've grown to care about Rhaenys, so watching her experience that loss as she falls to her own death is an incredible bit of television. And there are so many others, with my personal favorite being when she's out over the bay just after Aegon and Sunfire fall, and she tells Meleys to attack. A futile gesture that seems at home in this type of war. Rook's Rest is a major step on the path to ruin for House Targaryen. Rest in peace to the queen who never was, and her mount, the Red Queen. How will each faction react now that things have been changed forever? Will the Greens embrace Aemond, who could be their key to victory? And how will the new Rhaenyra, who committed to winning her claim or die trying, respond now that the destruction necessary to win has been visited on her home? As I said at the beginning, I've never been so excited about this series, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.